Chapter 10 covers a whole host of information, from various types of punctuation to different rules for capitalizing words in your writing. So because it has so much information, I'm going to break this down into 3 separate videos. The first one will cover 9 comma rules and rules for using a semicolon. The second video will talk about using quotation marks and apostrophes, and the final video will be dedicated to capitalization. So this one is going to focus on 9 comma rules as well as 2 usages of a semicolon. So the first of the 9 comma rules you've already studied in previous chapters, and it is about the comma that goes in between 2 independent clauses in a compound sentence when those 2 clauses are joined with one of your fanboys or a coordinating conjunction. So for example, I have, she wanted to study, but she was so tired. 2 independent clauses, 2 complete sentences, joined with the word but, which is one of your fanboys or a coordinating conjunction. The rule is when you join 2 complete sentences with a fanboy, you need a comma in front of the fanboy. The second rule that I want to talk to you about has to do with introductory words. Whenever you have a phrase or a clause or even a single word that comes in front of the subject of your sentence, the main clause of your sentence, those introductory words need to be offset with a comma. So for example, before returning to work, I made sure to check my email. The subject of the sentence is I. The verb is made, so this is the main clause of the sentence. To let the reader know that you're introducing that main clause, you need to use a comma at the end of the introductory word or phrase or clause. In this case, the introductory prepositional phrase is before returning to work. So I would have a comma right there. So the way to think about this rule, which is the introductory words rule, is that if you have anything that comes before the subject of your sentence, you put a comma after those introductory words. The third rule has to do with items in a series or a list. If you are listing 3 or more words or 3 or more phrases in a row, you separate the items in that list with commas. Again, the rule is 3 or more. So for example, my favorite foods are cookies, potatoes, and bread. I'm talking about 3 different things. Because I have a list of 3 or more items, I separate the items in that list with commas. So I would put a comma after the first item and after the second item. Just a note, in some circles you will hear that this comma is optional, but for most academic writing, the requirement is that you do include a comma before the last item in the list, because it really does prevent some confusion, which we'll talk about at a later point. So again, when you have 3 or more items in a list, those items need to be separated with commas. Those are the first 3 comma rules of 9. Here are the next 3. The fourth rule has to do with what are called coordinate adjectives. Coordinate adjectives occur when you have 2 or more adjectives coming in front of the noun, modifying the same noun. So for example, in this sentence, kind and beautiful are 2 adjectives that are both describing the woman. Because they're in a row and both modifying the same word, they have to be separated with commas. The only time you don't put a comma in between 2 adjectives in a row when they come in front of the noun is if they're not both modifying the noun, but one is modifying the other adjective. So for example, if you had, I built a red brick wall, there's 2 adjectives here, but you could separate you can't separate them with the word and, because red is explaining the kind of brick, brick is explaining the kind of wall. So the rule of thumb is if you could take away that comma and put an and, Wanda is a kind and beautiful woman, then there needs to be a comma there. If the and wouldn't make sense, like I built a red and brick wall, that doesn't make sense, so you would not put a comma there. So with coordinate adjectives, if you have two or more adjectives in front of a noun, and you could put the word and in between those adjectives, then you need to put a comma. Okay? The next rule has to do with extra unnecessary information. So for example, if I have Maria, who studied hard, will pass. I have my subject and I have my verb. I could take this information away. It's helpful in the sentence, but it's not necessary for the meaning of the sentence to be maintained. If I took this away, I would have Maria will pass, and that makes sense. If I took that information away, the sentence still makes sense, which means that extra information needs to be surrounded with commas. Another example of this would be Shelley, my neighbor, is nice. This is extra information that's further telling me who Shelley is, so I need to surround it with commas. You want to look at this in one of two ways. You want to make sure that the information really is not necessary for the sentence. So for example, if instead I had all students who study hard will pass, I need that information, because if I took it away, I would have all students will pass. Do you see how that changes the meaning of the sentence? It's not that all students will pass, it's that all of those students who study hard will pass. I need that information, so I do not put commas there. I only put commas if it's surrounding information that I don't need. Another comma rule, the next comma rule, has to do with interrupting the flow of your writing. If you drop a transitional word in your sentence, or put one at the beginning or at the end, that's what's called an interrupter, and it needs to be surrounded with commas. It's similar to this rule in that those interrupting words or phrases are often unnecessary to the sentence. So for example, this word, however, interrupts my sentence, and it's not necessary for the meaning of my sentence. I have my subject and my verb. It is necessary to study. Because I've dropped that transition word in the middle, and it's unnecessary for the sentence, I need to surround it with commas. So this has to do with interrupting words or interrupting phrases in the middle of your sentence. Okay, the last three comma rules are quite a bit simpler than these. The next one is called direct address. If I, as the writer, am speaking or writing directly to a person and using that person's name, I need to offset the name with commas. So for example, if I'm speaking to Sam and saying, please pass me that book, Sam, I need to put a comma in front of the person's name. I'm speaking to Sam, I'm using his name. That makes it direct address. If you're speaking to a person and using that person's name, you offset the name from the rest of the sentence with a comma, like that. Okay, the next rule has to do with dates. You separate the day in a date from the year with a comma, and the year from the rest of the sentence with a comma. So for example, I separate the day from the year with a comma, And if I had put the day of the week in here, my birthday is on Tuesday, I would also put a comma after the day. So with dates, you separate the day from the month and the date from the year with commas. The final rule has to do with the address of a street. You separate the name of the street from the city and the city from the state with a comma. So for example, she lives at 123 Happy Lane in Houston, Texas. I separate the address from the rest of the sentence and the city from the state with a comma. Okay, so that concludes the 9 comma rules. Now I want to move on to the 2 reasons that you would use a semicolon in writing. The first one is a review. We've talked about it previously. So if you have a compound sentence, which means you have 2 independent clauses joined together, one way to join those 2 independent clauses is with a semicolon. So for example, he is very friendly. He always says hello. I've got subject, verb, subject, verb. If I have 2 independent clauses, 2 complete sentences, the punctuation that joins those 2 independent clauses together is a semicolon. So it would go right there. We've talked about this previously. That's one reason you would use a semicolon to join 2 complete sentences. The second reason has to do with something called a super comma. So let's go back to the rule where you use a comma to separate items in a list or items in a series. If those items already have commas in them, it would be confusing to add more commas to separate the items in the list. So instead you use a semicolon or a super comma. Let me show you an example. If I have, she has lived in Walnut, California, Spokane, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. You already know that one of your comma rules is you need to separate cities from states with a comma. So I need to put a comma here, here, and here. This is also items in a series. So you would normally separate those items with another comma. But you can see how if I put a comma here and here, it gets very confusing. She has lived in Walnut, California, Spokane, Washington. It makes it seem like they're separate things. That's very confusing. So instead of adding more commas, you would use a super comma, which is in fact a semicolon, to separate the items in the list. So I would put a semicolon here and here. Okay, so that concludes this portion of the Chapter 10 lecture with 9 comma rules and 2 different usages of the semicolon.